Head over keels. Actual naval stories. Smart Lieutenant. The fierce German battleship Tirpitz, supposedly hunted for Convoy PQ17. This information remained unconfirmed, but nevertheless, British cruisers were given the order to turn around, leaving the merchant ships defenseless. July 4, 1942, Convoy PQ17 was scattered across the Barents Sea and had a slim chance of getting to Arkhangelsk safely. German U-boats scoured the sea. The sky was full of enemy aircraft. A British trawler, HMS Ayrshire, together with 3 transport ships loaded with military supplies for the Red Army, sailed north. Leo Gradwell, Royal Navy Lieutenant, assumed command of this small convoy. Gradwell was an advocate by trade, but having a coastal navigation certificate, he enlisted in the Navy with the outbreak of war. He understood clearly that any encounter with the enemy would end tragically for his mini convoy. Gradwell had to think of something. Standing on the bridge of the ice-covered Ayrshire, the lieutenant ordered the crew of the transport carrying tanks on the deck to place their cargo in operational readiness. Bristling with guns, the merchant became a warship ready to repel the enemy. However, tank guns couldn't deal with German bomber planes, for which the 4 ships of the mini convoy in the middle of the frozen ocean were an easy target. Then, having discovered drums of white paint in the cargo hold, Gradwell decided to repaint the ships. But there wasn't enough paint, so the decks and combat vehicles were covered with white linen taken from laundry. Luftwaffe planes flying over the ice were unable to find the camouflaged convoy. Under the cover of rising fog, Gradwell's ships were able to sneak undetected towards Novaya Zemlya. When Gradwell saw the Soviet flag in the distance, he knew that they were safe. Of the 35 transport ships of Convoy PQ17, only 11 made it to Arkhangelsk, and 3 of them have the smart decisions made by Lieutenant Leo Gradwell to thank for that.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another World of Warships livestream with me, Mr. Conway. We have a really exciting show for you tonight. I'm joined by some really special guests, and we're going to have the second iteration of our Armchair Admirals series. And today we're going to be talking about the Arctic Convoys, and in particular focusing on Convoy PQ17 that you already saw showcased in our little video there. We've got lots of these fantastic videos. Check out our YouTube channel if you want to see more. Let me introduce my co-host, Mr. Tuccy. Hello, Tuccy. How are you doing?
Hello, folks. I'm doing fine. And I'm glad to be on the second installment of this streaming experience. I think we have a lot of nice assets. We have 2 very good guests, and we have a pretty interesting topic to cover.
Yes, we have the best guests.
Yes, and the best words.
Let's say hello to them. Hello, guys. It's nice to have you back again.
Which I have returned. History brownie point to anybody who catches the reference.
Indeed, and hello again as well from me.
Yes, so if you guys happen to live under like a YouTube rock and you don't know who these guys are, on your, left, yes, is the mighty Jingles, who does things on YouTube. You should go follow him. And to the right is Drachinifel, probably the most prolific ship nerd on YouTube. If you need to know anything about any ship, he will likely have a video guide on it, and you'll learn all about it. His channel is excellent. You should go and subscribe to both these people. Fantastic. Now, before we dive into actually talking about Convoy PQ17, because I always leave like the planning of these episodes a little bit to these guys because they know more about ships than me. Why did we choose to talk about Arctic Convoys and PQ17 today?
Well, I think probably the main reason is that we are always trying to pick like a monthly theme, and the Convoy PQ17 shenanigans happened in July, so that's basically it. That's the main reason why we are picking the PQ17. We had other interesting topics in the store. For example, Operation Catapult, but yeah, I think we will reach them in due time as well.
That's the good thing about history. There's plenty of it.
Yes.
There's always getting to be more of it.
Yes, that's true. But I mean, not the history that we're talking about, luckily, right? Okay, so who would like to give the guests or the viewers who don't know anything about Arctic Convoys or PQ17 like a rough TLDR of what is the Arctic Convoy? Why is the Arctic Convoy? Where did it go from? Where to? And where from?
Well,
Jingles, volunteers, fantastic.
Well, in a nutshell, in the summer of 1941, Russia suddenly developed an extremely large and German-shaped problem. And while they'd largely been mostly uninterested in World War II up until that point, other than trying and failing to annex large parts of Finland, they suddenly decided that they were best buds with Britain and America. Please send us lots and lots of help, which they, of course, denied ever needing afterwards, in the shape of the Arctic Convoys. Aid was being sent to Russia through the Asian route in, I believe it was Iran, but it was an extremely long route, and it was difficult.
It was slightly inconvenient because there was no railway and only, at least at the beginning, only dust roads across the mountains. So, basically everything you were shipping through there either had to go on its own, like tanks and stuff, which isn't really too good for them, or it had to be loaded on trucks and unloaded from trucks, and and then there was a second route that was theoretically shortest, but it had a little tiny problem called Japan. So basically,
although not a lot of people know this, but the Russians did do their own convoys from the USA across the Pacific, because Russia was never at war with Japan until after they finished with Germany, and then quickly declared war on Japan for as long as it took to loot the entire contents of Manchuria and then get back over the Russian border.
The convoys from the US included also US ships sailing under the Soviet flag.
Yes.
Because, well, Japan, I mean, they were trying to, they were kind of maintaining the balance, because they didn't want to too much tick off Germany by not going after these supplies, but they also didn't want to tick off the USSR by going after them. So they sunk something here and there, but they tried not to overdo it.
The only downside of all of that was obviously it meant that once you delivered everything to the Russian Pacific coast, you now have to cross pretty much the entirety of Russia to get to anywhere that is actually useful, which includes that wonderful area known as Siberia.
Even though
not an easy route, right?
Yeah, where this route was useful was for supplying fairly large amounts of American planes to Soviet Union, because there was a air bridge established between Alaska and the Far East, basically flying especially Air Cobras and Key Cobras over.
The other downside with the land route through Iran was that it took more fuel to send fuel on that route than you could carry and deliver at the other end.
Cool. There's a guy in chat called Commander Johannesson who says he's spent his whole working career in the Barents Sea. Stick around. Maybe you can help us with some things later. Because I know that some of you are here for bonus codes, and we do also have a bonus code. Let me just really quickly chat, right? Like, calm down. Bonus code, right? So this is today's bonus code. It's a fantastic little German word in the tradition of trying to teach you some excellent German words. This is another excellent German word. Now, Drahtesel, Mr. Jingles, can you guess what Drahtesel? Okay, I'll translate it for you literally, right? It's iron donkey or wire donkey. What do you think it refers to?
I have
wire donkey.
I haven't got the faintest idea. We'll see if Akazuki knows. Akazuki, what's a wire donkey? Now stop sniffing Zhu's bum. And answer the question. No. One word from me, and she does whatever she likes.
Drachinifel? What's your guess? What does a Drahtesel mean? A wire donkey.
Something that's extremely stubborn.
No, it's a bicycle. Come on.
Why?
Wire donkey. Okay.
It's a donkey made of wire, right? It gets you where you need to go. Okay, fantastic.
Donkey's well known for being the world's first two-wheeled animal.
Yep.
Yes, sort of. I'm not saying it makes much sense, but it's a fantastic word. So, guys, this activates a mission in game, right? If you already activated yesterday's bonus code, this code will do nothing for you. If you haven't, it'll give you a mission. It'll give you German aircraft carrier early access container. Go complete it. You can find it in your combat mission tab. Anyway, back to the program.
Yes.
So Arctic convoys happened, right? Supplies needed to get there. Now
they needed to get there fast.
Yes.
The fastest way was via the Arctic convoy route because there were two principal ports, Archangel and Murmansk. Archangel, better port, iced up for large portions of the year. Murmansk was the only open water port they had that wasn't blocked off by ice all the time.
Yeah.
So
we have we have two excellent videos actually in our Naval Legends series on YouTube, and we've cut a few snippets out of these so that you can see what this route actually is, right? So we'll tell you a little bit about how these convoys worked, specifically also about Convoy PQ17, and then we'll get into some questions and discuss the things, right? So let's have a look at how ships got there.
To deliver the supplies to the front line as quickly as possible, the Allies decided to use a naval route to the ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk through the Greenland and Barents Seas. The convoys were formed in Iceland, in the Kaldvijord or Reykjavik, as well as in northern Scotland at the Loch Ewe base. Depending on the ice conditions, the route lay either to the north or south of Bear Island, in a very narrow corridor between Svalbard and the Norwegian coast. The final destination points for the convoys were the ports of Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, and Molotovsk. A cruise like this lasted for 10 to 14 days.
Okay, so you can see it goes through a pretty inhospitable, frigid...
Yeah, it's inhospitable, it's cold, and it's also pretty close to Norway, which was occupied by Germany at the time.
And that was quite a lot in this
lots of aircraft.
And that was another problem with Murmansk as a port, because while it's ice-free the entire year, it was also in very comfortable range for German bombers. So
yes, the closest German airfield in northern Norway was actually only 70 miles away from Murmansk.
Yeah,
they suffered daily bombing raids.
Yeah. So en route, the Arctic convoys had to deal, not just with adverse environment, but we've got a little clip here to show this, so you can see what the conditions were like on these ships. I wouldn't you couldn't pay me enough to get on one of those ships.
These are Arctic waters. Even in summer, it's only 4 degrees Celsius. You won't hold on for more than 5 minutes. Hence, you must fight for your vessel. And they fought.
Along the entire route, the convoy faced extreme risks. Storms and fog were frequent in Arctic waters. Ice was all around you. Huge lumps of ice would grow on the vessel's superstructures, and the ship could capsize if you didn't remove them in time. And don't forget about the German submarines, which could be anywhere, and enemy aviation. All this made the Arctic convoys extremely treacherous.
Yeah, so in conclusion, not a great route to go sailing. Not a pleasure cruise.
Yeah, the icing, I mean, there were a lot of cases when merchant ships that were going with a convoy or even escort ship had to turn back because of ice damage. There were also 2 cases when escort ships, they were both wooden hull whalers that were being transferred to Soviet Union to serve as minesweepers. They just got so iced up that they capsized and sunk, without warning, without survivors.
Yeah, stability is a serious issue. It does not take the higher up in the ship, the water or flooding is, the less is required to flip the ship over. And the thing about the ice, it's all very, very high in the ship. And even if it didn't capsize the ship, it could break off parts of the superstructure if enough ice built up. It can seize your weapons up. It's bad stuff. It has to be dealt with on a daily, continual basis.
Yeah,
and of course, the warship has the crew spare to do that. The merchantman sometimes only had a crew of 30, and they just didn't have the manpower.
Also got to bear in mind that it's not just quote unquote ice, we're talking about sea ice here. So lots of salt in there, as the sea is salty, which means that especially if you're a warship, especially when you're talking about the early to mid 1940s, when radar, electronics, etc., are all becoming quite widespread on warships, the warship itself is actually quite warm, relatively speaking, compared to the Arctic Ocean. And so if the interior of that ice starts to melt off into sensitive parts of your turrets and your radar and everything, you've effectively got concentrated brine, which is going to be absolutely wonderful for eating away at practically everything on your ship. So that's why those ice breaking parties on the deck, they weren't there because the captain didn't like them. They were there to make sure that the ship remained operational and, as Jingles mentioned, upright, both of which are fairly important.
And I think in the circumstances where somebody did go overboard, because being an Arctic Ocean, I think water temperature is something around 4 degrees.
Yeah, something around that. Yeah.
So life expectancy of somebody going overboard would be
2
measured
minutes.
in 2 minutes. Yeah.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very. I was expecting like 5 or something, but 2.
Depends what you're wearing.
Yeah, depends on what you're wearing. Generally, it was with the like heavy clothing and stuff. It tended to be like up to 10 minutes, but basically it's minutes. Like if you are not picked up within minutes, you have to be very, very, very lucky.
Yeah, I mean, if your ship got torpedoed when you were in your off watch, so you're in your rack and at most you're wearing your pajamas, 2 minutes. If you were on watch on the bridge, which were exposed, so you would have had plenty of clothing on, warm weather clothing, a big thick greatcoat, sweater, maybe 10 minutes. But even then, that's assuming you could stay treading water wearing that amount of clothing. So either way, it wasn't looking good for you.
Yeah,
and that's obviously not also accounting for the weather, because if it's a flat calm, you might last a bit longer. If you've got high seas, which to be honest is probably the circumstance where you're more likely to go overboard, high seas, driving wind, snow, sleet, etc., that's going to steal the heat straight out from you incredibly fast. I mean, there's a reason the Scharnhorst survivors wouldn't even fill a single mess deck.
Yeah. Now, you saw in the infographic earlier, it took 10 to 14 days to make this journey. We'll have a little look at like what kind of ship we're talking about that made this journey for the most part. You can recognize it in game as the ship where you can pick up your containers, by the way, and what kind of formation they sailed in. So we'll go back to the video.
However, in harsh Arctic conditions, the heavily loaded cargo ships couldn't sail faster than 10 knots, so the convoy passed by the Germans at the speed of the slowest vessel, about 12 miles per hour. The convoy's movement order was a formation with merchant vessels and tankers in the middle. They were surrounded by close escort ships. As a rule, these were destroyers, corvettes, minesweepers, and armed trawlers. A bit farther away, at a distance of several miles, they were accompanied by light cruisers. The convoy kept its distant covering forces, which consisted of heavy ships within 50 miles of its core. The escort ships were arranged in such a way that their fields of fire created a closed-loop perimeter. Sometimes, 2 or 3 submarines were sailing behind the convoy. The ratio between escort ships and merchant vessels was 1 warship per 2 to 2.5 transports.
Okay, so now I have an immediate question for you, watching that. Why on earth would you have your covering force so far away?
Because you want to intercept things before they get within shooting or torpedoing range of the ships that you're trying to protect. It's like when the British soldiers on the beaches of Dunkirk complained that they never saw the RAF at all. That's not that the RAF weren't doing anything. They were breaking up the German bomber formations 60 miles inland, because shooting at German bombers while they're bombing the troops isn't doing the troops any good. You need to intercept them before they get into a position where they can do any harm.
And bear in mind, you've got multiple forms of threat. So you've got the air threat, you've got the submarine threat, and you've got the surface threat. And so most of the convoys, at least for a good part of their journey, would have a close protection force and a distant protection force. So your anti-submarine vessels and your anti-aircraft vessels would stick closer to the convoy. But let's face it, as we said, if Tirpitz or Scharnhorst or Admiral Scheer or any of the others have got into gun range, they're quite happily going to pop a few shots off at the merchant ships, even if they're also fighting the escorts. So that distant cover force, which is primarily there to deal with the heavy surface raiders, they've got to be far enough away that they can intercept, meet, engage, and hopefully destroy or drive off any raiders without those raiders getting anywhere close to the convoy. Because the other factor as well is that even if you manage to drive off a heavy surface raider, if it gets within visual range of a convoy, they now have an exact fix on where that convoy is, which means you'll be seeing the Luftwaffe in a couple of hours.
And another reason for the covering force to be relatively far away from the convoy was that there was also, basically, they would have liked if torpedoes came out and played, because that was one of the biggest problems with sinking torpedoes, like catching it somewhere where it can be sunk. And if the heavy cover force would be too close, then probably torpedoes wouldn't even try and come out to play. So,
couldn't they just drive a battleship down the fjord?
They did it in 1940, but
It's the Warspite.
Yes,
and it single-handedly sunk a third of the entire German Navy's destroyer force.
Yep.
Yeah, the main problem you have with driving a battleship down a fjord when there's another battleship waiting for you is that those kind of ranges, armor basically would mean nothing.
Yeah.
And accuracy would be almost near enough guaranteed because it would be a flat shoot. And given that the fact that obviously it's kind of home field advantage for the Germans, they can have spotters on the mountaintops, they're probably going to have air superiority, etc. That means that Tirpitz is going to be waiting for you to come around the corner with its entire main battery pointed at you, and in that kind of scenario, seconds.
That's even assuming you make it that far, because trust me, the approach will be mined.
Mines, torpedoes, aircraft.
And even the rocks, because I mean it was bad enough even with the home field advantage in the operation that the Kriegsmarine planned to intercept the PQ17. It was supposed to be quite a big operation with Tirpitz, Hipper, Admiral Scheer and Lutzow, and a lot of destroyers. And just on the way through the fjords, 3 of the destroyers and Scheer ran aground.
Wow. Okay.
So, you don't want to really get into that area.
I definitely wouldn't want to be the captain having to explain to high command that I've beached. I don't think that probably didn't go well. Okay, cool. So, do you want to say a little bit about PQ17 before we have a look at our the first contact with the enemy that PQ17 had?
I'd just quickly recap basically the start of the convoys. Probably, I think the British gentleman will then take over when we get to action, because basically first convoy for the USSR sailed already in August 1941. It was the Operation Dervish. It consisted of 6 merchant ships, which went to Arkhangelsk, carried Hurricanes, which were like the most important cargo, and the convoy was not attacked. For one, the Kriegsmarine didn't really expect it so early, and also basically the German High Command thought that the USSR will collapse anyway, so no need to try to go into Arctic and do some mischief there, because it's area where you don't go unless you really have to. And the following convoy, the PQ1, from initials of an officer in the staff who was planning these convoys, was sailing in September, end of September, and again, it wasn't attacked. In fact, the first convoy to be attacked was PQ7A, where transport ship was sunk, and that was in December 1941, end of December. So basically for half a year, the convoys were passing without any opposition apart from obviously the weather itself, which was kind of good because they started in the summer, and there's one big problem of the Arctic summer. It's that there's always light, which makes it kind of easy to find ships. But obviously, once the Germans realized that USSR wouldn't go down peacefully quickly, they started focusing on the northern route on the convoys, because for one, it was the only route they can try to intercept, and for two, as we mentioned, it was fastest and stuff. And then it started getting very, very costly for the Allies. I think, I think I can hand over to those more knowledgeable than me.
You're looking at
Yeah,
me.
well, you've got to remember that the Arctic Convoys, it's not just the daylight during the summer you've got to worry about. It's a very much catch-22, because daylight, near enough 24-hour daylight, perfect opportunity for aircraft to attack you around the clock. Not so brilliant for submarines. It's much easier to spot them. Submarines have to run on the surface to get into position. And even for surface raiders, bearing in mind they're raiders, they really don't want to be tangling with the escorts. Whilst radar is present on both sides in various forms, it's much easier for a surface ship to sneak in and sneak close in the dark, especially with the kind of foul weather that you can get, which would quite often disable radars or give them false readings. So summertime, really bad time to be attacked by the Luftwaffe, but as the hours close in and it gets darker, the air threat diminishes, but the underwater threat and the surface threat actually increases.
So you're kind of screwed if you do, you're screwed if you don't.
Yep.
Okay, well, let's have a look at PQ17's first contact with the enemy.
The first week went by without any incidents, and the sailors hoped it would stay that way until the destination port. At dawn on July 4th, convoy PQ17 was spotted by a German reconnaissance aircraft. After midday, the airstrikes began. Bombers and torpedo aircraft approached from a right angle, but all their attempts to destroy the convoy were fiercely repelled. During one of such raids, destroyer Wainwright rushed towards the attacking aircraft at full speed, firing from all guns. The ship's counterattack was pretty successful. The lead airplane was shot down, and the rest dropped their torpedoes too early and scattered. Nevertheless, German aviation managed to sink 2 merchant ships, but despite the losses, the convoy maintained formation and continued on.
Okay. Who wants jingles? So, PQ17, attack number 1 happened. Two merchantmen down. But then is when it gets bad. Do you want to shed some light?
Sorry, I don't know the specifics of each individual attack. I mean, I've read on the subject, but you're going to have to refer to somebody slightly more with slightly more specific knowledge on the subject than me.
Okay, Drachinifel.
Well,
if we need specifics.
The thing was with the escalating attacks is that, and this is something we'll probably come on to in some of the specific questions later on as well, is that the Allied escort group, as we mentioned before, you've got close and distant protection groups. So during the initial part of that voyage, the distant protection group, which is there mainly to protect against the heavy raiders, is still present, obviously standing off slightly. So air attack at this point is the main hazard, which is obviously what we just saw demonstrated there. However, as the convoy gets closer and closer to its destination, roughly around the point that they hit, well, not literally, but hit the point where Bear Island is, then a lot of the escort group has to turn back because German air superiority beyond that point was rated as too dangerous for the heavy ships to go in. It was too much of a risk of getting a battleship or a carrier, or even some of the cruisers disabled, damaged, or possibly even destroyed, and that in turn would leave the convoy a lot weaker. So the fact that at the point where the convoy's escort is actually at its theoretical maximum strength, you're already starting to lose ships. It's not a good sign when going forward for the rest of the attacks, because things are only going to get worse.
Yeah.
But as far as I understood, the main issue is then that intelligence was intercepted that Tirpitz was actually leaving the fjord on its way to go hunt down the convoy.
I think we will get to that soon, because that's like...
is that later?
That's the fairly critical point.
Because, this is all happening basically on one day. It's July the 4th. The convoy is already on the way for a week. So the Germans are ready, the distant cover is ready as well. One thing also that formed a lot of the decisions at that moment was that the Royal Navy actually suffered quite serious losses just prior to this, because basically first the HMS Trinidad, a light cruiser, torpedoed herself.
True story.
I could see the sigh of exasperation from Drachinifel. It's like, yes.
They'd sailed without enough antifreeze,
Yeah.
and that bit them in the arse. The torpedo launching mechanism had basically iced up. The Germans had quite a strong destroyer force based in the north of Norway, only 80 miles from the Kola Inlet, consisting of 3 of the Z-class destroyers, Z-24, 25, and 26. They had the misfortune to be picked up by the Trinidad's radar, who steamed to intercept, and the Z-26 took a fearful pounding. Her engines were damaged, her rear gun turrets were unable to fire, she was burning, she was slowing down, and as the Trinidad pulled up alongside her at a range of 1,500 yards, the torpedo officer was instructed to fire. So he did. 2 torpedoes stayed where they were with their motors running, frozen in the tubes, unable to leave. The 3rd torpedo launched, hit the water, porpoised, flipped, and came straight back at the Trinidad, hitting her basically right underneath the torpedo mount. She didn't sink, but she was out of the fight.
Yep. So, in the next convoy, Trinidad made it to Murmansk, but the Soviets didn't have enough equipment to actually fix her. They didn't have armor plating and all the stuff needed. So, in one of the next convoys, the HMS Edinburgh brought all this to repair Trinidad. At the same time, I think it was the same convoy when the Allies suffered quite serious losses due to friendly fire, because the battleship King George V rammed and sunk destroyer HMS Punjabi, and then 2 ships from the convoy escorts sunk a Polish submarine that was part of the escort of the convoy.
Yeah, there were submarine escorts for the convoys as well.
And also don't forget when Punjabi went down, her depth charges went off as the battleships that she was supposed to be leading were passing over, and that many depth charges going off right underneath even a 35,000 plus ton battleship does tend to break things.
Yeah, so this was basically disaster number 2. Disaster number 3 was HMS Edinburgh herself, basically damaged by submarine first, and then...
Wasn't the Edinburgh carrying
lots of
gold bullion, which was part of the payment that Russia was sending back for the supplies in the Arctic
Exactly.
Convoys?
I think it was something like $20 million US back then worth.
Yeah.
So
a lot more now.
Yes.
Relatively recently salvaged, and oddly enough, despite the fact it was theoretically earmarked to pay America, the people who actually got the gold back were Russia and Britain, because the Americans had the losses covered by insurance at the time. So once the salvage was done, it was Russian gold, and it was on a British warship. So we divvied that up between us quite nicely.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's good.
So
but I feel we are digressing a slight, but from PQ17 at this point.
We are basically building the picture, because so that was Edinburgh lost. Then 2 weeks after Edinburgh, the Trinidad basically patched up quickly, sailed, but she was sunk by planes, basically aircraft attack, and 1 torpedo hit basically right across the old torpedo damage, so basically she was lost. Yeah. So in a very short time period, for once the Allies lost 24 merchant ships on the Northern Convoy duty, and they lost quite a lot of warships, either sunk outright or damaged. So this was weighing very heavily on the Admiralty, and the PQ17 was a very, very hot topic before she sailed even. Basically, she was sent as basically a political sacrifice to appease Roosevelt and Stalin.
Yeah. And it wasn't just the ships that were being sunk on the convoy routes. Ships were being sunk in Murmansk, which was basically nothing more than a fishing village. Very limited jetty facilities. They had no cranes, limited warehouse facilities. All of the ships had to be unloaded by hand, which took, in some cases, months. Non-existent repair facilities beyond what the Royal Navy senior naval officer present at Murmansk was capable of organising for himself, from the crews and engineers of the ships that happened to be there at the time. And of course, daily air raids, because the nearest German airfield was only 70 miles away in northern Norway. So once you got to Murmansk, it wasn't over.
Yes. And Yeah, and in this situation, so the convoy was attacked by air, which in itself the rate wasn't too devastating by the convoy escorts and even the convoy merchantmen. They expected worse, but at the same time, there were reports of turpits possibly sailing out of the fjord.
Yeah,
and that's where we are getting to the big problem.
Yes, the big problem. This was the big problem.
Tirpitz was Germany's most modern and powerful warship. Her mere presence in Norway forced the British to keep their main naval forces in that region. The battleship was used in military campaigns only at the direct order of High Command.
Yes, so the big problem was, of course, that Tirpitz was coming into play, according to information the Allies got.
Yeah. And it wasn't just the Tirpitz, of course. There were the 3 heavy cruisers, the Scheer, the Lutzow, and the Hipper, which would have been a handful, but then backed up by the Tirpitz as well. And, of course, overwhelming air superiority. The air would have been thick with Luftwaffe dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. So a bit of a handful, even though it's entirely likely that the distant covering force, the heavy covering force, which consisted of, was it the Duke of York, the USS Washington? I mean, the USS Washington was easily a match for the Tirpitz. And they weren't alone. They had a bunch of heavy cruisers, loads of destroyers.
Victorious as well, the carrier.
Victorious, the carrier. And there was the carrier that is thought to have been the deciding factor for the Germans to say, actually, no. Bearing in mind what had happened to the Bismarck. If they'd lost the Tirpitz, it would have been unthinkable.
That was basically the condition for the Tirpitz to actually get a green light from Berlin to sail.
Yeah.
Basically, this was kind of a battle that both sides were trying to fight by remote. The German forces were basically completely controlled from Berlin, and the convoy and the covering forces were controlled from London. So basically, the commanders on the spot had basically no opportunities to
no
decide
autonomy
by themselves.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
I think
the condition for the Tirpitz to get a green light was that the British aircraft carrier would be spotted and located like with a 100% accuracy, so that you know where it is.
Yeah. And they could base their plans on that. And of course, that was never really the case. They didn't know exactly where it was, so they didn't want to take the risk. Because the thing about the Tirpitz, I mean, they're called the Lonely Queen of the North. The threat that she posed was out of all proportion to her actual combat effectiveness. Because the Tirpitz existed, the convoys had to be protected by a close escort group, a distant escort group, and a heavy covering force. And that was a major tie-up of naval resources, all because of one ship. So losing the Tirpitz was unthinkable. If there was any chance that the Tirpitz was going to be lost, turn it around, get it back into safety. Because even if it never fired its guns in anger, and the Tirpitz only fired its guns in anger once during the entire course, well, aside from its anti-aircraft guns, which it fired a lot, as both the Royal Air Force and the Russian Air Force tried to bomb it. But the only time it ever fired its main guns in anger was when it shot up a Norwegian weather station.
Yep.
But despite that, the threat that it posed tied down massive amounts of resources and meant that every convoy had to be escorted heavily.
Yeah, actually, Tirpitz
you've got to
sailed.
remember, you never want to fight fair.
No.
If you can avoid it. So the fact that you had 2 battleships, an aircraft carrier, and all their escorts there, just in case Tirpitz came out, it can be interpreted and has been misinterpreted at times as the Allies going, oh no, Tirpitz, well, look at what happened with Bismarck at Denmark. Straight Tirpitz will easily sink a single battleship. We must send out lots and lots. No, it's not like that. They were pretty confident that either one of those battleships could handle Tirpitz. But the thing is, they had more than one battleship available, and roll the dice, luck of war, a one-on-one battleship engagement where the 2 sides are approximately evenly matched. And let's face it, any one of those 3 ships in a one-on-one has a decent chance against the other. Say, roll the dice, one unlucky roll, and you've now you've lost another battleship, which is bad, and 2, the Tirpitz is now heading for your convoy, which is even worse. So why run that risk?
Yeah,
if you've got the extra ships, you put them in the convoy. in the convoy covering forces.
Yeah.
But it does mean that you have now tied down a significant portion of your capital assets, and Tirpitz is still only the one ship.
Yeah, I mean, if you have two fists, you don't tie one of them behind your back when you go into a fight, unless you have to.
And basically, Tirpitz sailed against convoys earlier in the winter. It didn't find the convoy, the distant cover force didn't find Tirpitz. Basically, they all passed each other by like 60 miles. Well, it was polar night, so like...
It's probably not that easy to find something.
Yeah,
no.
exactly. Like it's kind of wonderful that in these conditions, the British torpedo planes managed to find Tirpitz and try to attack it, even though unsuccessfully. But again, it kind of drove home the paranoia the German high command felt about the aircraft carriers, because like we are here in the middle of the dark.
There's an amusing story about that, actually, because at the time, the Fleet Air Arm strike that was launched against Tirpitz was made up of albacores, which was supposed to be the successor to the Swordfish, obviously of Bismarck fame, actually turned out to be worse.
Yes.
Literally the only advantage that the albacore had over the Swordfish was it had an enclosed cockpit, so the pilots and the gunners didn't quite freeze as much as in a Swordfish, but it was actually overall slower, less maneuverable, shorter range, and that did lead to a rather interesting incident that I've actually read about in Destroyerman's account, where during the run that the albacores were making on Tirpitz, you had Tirpitz going in one direction at 30 knots. You had the albacores trying to chase, only capable of 90 knots in a flat calm. You had quite a strong counter headwind coming the other way. Bearing in mind this is the Arctic Ocean, the weather's not particularly great. So their actual true indicated airspeed was ridiculously low, to the point that one of the destroyers that was trying to get in close actually overtook them. So you can imagine you're in a torpedo bombing aircraft, and you look out your window and you're being overhauled by a destroyer.
That doesn't sound ideal. By the way, there's a comment from Kismet here, and he says, "Interesting to see the Germans treat the Tirpitz the same way as the Japanese did the Yamato."
Kinda, sort of, yeah.
Well,
For
to be
different
honest, I'd say the
reasons, but
Kriegsmarine actually tried to make more use of the Tirpitz than the Japanese did of Yamato. With about the same level of success, but...
Yeah, the Yamato did come out to fight on at least 2 separate occasions.
Yeah.
But never more than that.
Okay, so let's get back to PQ17,
Yes.
right? So Tirpitz leaves Fjord, Allies get wind of it, and then is where things go, well, I think slightly balls
Pear-shaped.
up, right?
Yeah.
Pear-shaped. Let's have a look at what happened, because...
At 2111, a radiogram came from the Admiralty saying, "Cruiser force withdraw to the westward at high speed." The squadron of cruisers and destroyers, which were sailing in front, suddenly turned. The astonished crews of the merchant vessels saw them pass by and head westward.
Now, I guess this is one of the most or more controversial decisions, I guess, made in World War II.
Yes.
It didn't include the follow-up order for the actual convoy. Does somebody want to give some context on that?
What, the order to scatter?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, because they sent 3 signals. I can't remember the exact text of all 3. I think I might have it written down somewhere.
I have a cheat sheet here.
No, I've got it. The first signal sent at 2111 from the Admiralty. Cruiser force withdraw to the westward at high speed. Hang on, westward. That's away from Norway. That's into the Atlantic, isn't it? Yeah.
Yep.
12 minutes later, the Admiralty sent another signal. Owing to threat from surface ships, convoys to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. And then just while everybody was trying to figure out whether or not that was some kind of joke, 3 minutes later, they followed up with another signal: convoy is to scatter. And the whole point of a convoy is you stay together for protection. And if you scatter, well, that makes you a harder target for the surface raiders, but it makes you a sitting duck for aircraft and submarines.
And basically,
this is the catch-22 that you've got. This is a catch-22 that you've got permanently on the Arctic routes, because you've got to bear in mind that the order to scatter was not without precedent in terms of effectiveness. over in the Atlantic when the Scharnhorst had been out, and also actually Admiral Scheer, when you had the last stand of Rawalpindi and the last stand of Jervis Bay. In both of those cases, those ships had bought time for the convoy to scatter, and as a result, the merchant ships in the convoy, although the Germans were able to hunt down some, they weren't able to hunt down anywhere near as much as they would have been if the convoy had stayed together. So in light of what they thought was going to happen, which was Tirpitz and its escort group turning up, then an order to scatter makes a certain degree of sense when you don't have those battleships there to deal with the problem. But it's one of these things, hindsight is 2020. What they actually didn't realize was that at this point Tirpitz was actually already on its way home, and as Jingles mentioned, you're just laying yourself open for aircraft at this point, because now you don't have that concentrated AA barrage.
And while the precedent exists, you also have to bear in mind that when the Scharnhorst and the Scheer were on their rampage, they didn't enjoy the advantage of overwhelming air support.
No.
And my camera autofocus keeps messing me up. And on the other side, the convoys that were scattering didn't have two battleships and an aircraft carrier sitting off 300 miles away. And PQ17 did, and yet they were still ordered to scatter.
Another thing about this sequence of orders that was basically very confusing for the commanders on the spot and did lead to some more bad decisions was that basically the sequence of orders and the speed with which they were coming was basically indicating that the Tirpitz is like right over horizon, because first it was cruiser force withdraw westwards, which the commander of the cruiser force took as like basically battle is at hand. Then you had convoy is to disperse, which basically would mean that the merchant ships were to like spread out but still head in one direction.
Open their formation.
But then immediately you have the convoy is to scatter, so like run for your lives.
That suggests that the Tirpitz is just over the horizon. If you tell the cruisers to withdraw to the west, it's because the cruisers will get slaughtered by German heavy cruisers and the Tirpitz. So the Tirpitz is coming. Convoy disperse. Ooh, sounds bad. And then 3 minutes later, convoy scatter. That's like, oh my God, get out of there. You're all going to die.
That's basically when the commander of the destroyers escorting the convoys basically came to the clear conclusion that if there is a naval battle going to happen immediately, he would be of more use with the cruiser force, basically as part of the battle line. So he joined his 6 destroyers to the cruiser force, even though officers of one destroyer considered feigning engine trouble so that they can stay with the convoy, but in the end they didn't go through with it. But
the thing you've got, I was just going to say, the thing you've got to remember is that the Trinidad notwithstanding, especially in this kind of scenario, if you are possibly having to face off against heavy forces and you've got light cruisers and destroyers, the enemy's got heavy cruisers and battleships, one of your most effective weapons is going to be the torpedo. And whilst British cruisers did carry torpedo launchers, destroyers carried more of them and were much better placed, especially in the Arctic weather conditions, to deliver those torpedo attacks as compared to cruisers. So
basically,
makes a certain amount of sense.
Yeah, this decision meant that the cruiser force would get like 30 extra torpedoes, which was not a small amount.
Yeah, and if you look at the contrast between what happened with the light escorts for PQ17, when they thought they were coming under attack from a massively superior surface ship force, and what happened to the even lighter escorts of Task Force 3 in the Philippines when they were coming under attack from a force, one ship of which exceeded the entire tonnage of their entire task force, the Yamato, which was also backed up by multiple other battleships, heavy cruisers and destroyers. And the Americans attacked, damned the consequences, and they won. But PQ17 scattered and also had the advantage of a force equal to what they thought was coming 300 miles further off to the west.
Yeah, I think we have some questions actually about just what led to this. We'll discuss a bit later. But of course, what happened, one of the stories of what happened after PQ17 scattered, of course, you saw if you were here in the beginning. Otherwise, you can check out on our YouTube channel the what's the series called again? Head over Keels.
The Smart Lieutenant.
Smart Lieutenant. Yes, where he basically took off 3 of the ships They hid in the ice, found some paint in the hold, painted their ships white to disguise themselves, manned the tanks on top of the cargo ships to turn them into like semi-warships, and actually made it through in the end. But unfortunately, let's have a look. Most of the PQ17 suffered a different fate.
Yes.
And I think let's just put that into context in terms of what actually was on those ships that got lost.
Yes.
That's impressive.
That's very.
Together with the convoy's vessels, 430 tanks sank to the bottom of the Barents Sea. To put this into perspective, in July 1942, the Soviet Army had about 400 tanks on the entire Stalingrad front. 210 aircraft lost together with PQ17 accounted for 1/3 of the Red Army's air force that operated in July 1942 near Stalingrad. The Soviet Army didn't receive 3,350 cars, almost 1,000 more than the Stalingrad front had at its disposal.
And don't forget, of course, that if you believed Stalin, all of these supplies that he was screaming for until he was blue in the face were of no real consequence, didn't affect the outcome of the war, and Russia never really needed anyway.
But apart from this just pure material losses, the convoy also lost 24 merchant ships. That's basically the same amount that all the convoys before PQ17 lost. All in one go. And on top of this, there was the returning convoy from Russia, which passed through without being attacked, because the Germans obviously focused on the loaded ships, not on the empty ones. But due to navigational error and old maps and all sorts of things going wrong, it ran into Allied minefield of Iceland and lost 6 more ships, plus one minesweeper of escort. So basically in a space of a week, the Allies lost 30 cargo ships on the Arctic route. That was basically devastating.
And you've got to bear in mind, put this in the wider context of what's going on in the war at the time. So this is, you've got basically maximum need for merchant ships and warships, for that matter, on every single possible front.
Yeah.
Because the Mediterranean's ongoing. You've still got Mediterranean convoys you need to run. You've got the Atlantic convoys, obviously, the Arctic convoys, which is where this is happening. But you've also now got the Pacific theatre beginning to open up. So this is the point in the war, pre 1943, when the Italians capitulate, that there's the biggest possible demand on every hull afloat that the Allies possess, and the mass building program of Liberty ships and Victory ships hasn't quite spun up to the levels that it would do a little bit later on. So to lose such a massive chunk of both ships and war production at this point is a much, much heavier body blow than it would be at almost, not quite, but almost any other time of the war.
And don't forget that when we're looking at the number of escorts that are assigned to these convoys on paper, it looks like a fairly impressive number. But not all of those escorts are actually warships. A lot of them are converted trawlers, fishing boats with guns and depth charge launchers attached to them. Very, very good ships for seakeeping in the North Atlantic. But they're not really warships.
Yes.
But they're what we had, so they're what we used.
Yeah, basically 1 3-inch gun and depth charges, and that's it.
Yeah.
Good against U-boats, not tremendously brilliant against anything else.
There is a question from Nick has arrived. Would it have been better to split the ships in the convoy into pairs? Well, that's debatable. I mean, the Ayrshires mini convoy fared pretty well because they hid in the ice pack, but some ships tried to stick together for better protection, but generally it didn't really help because the merchant ships had usually very, very light anti-aircraft armament. They had 30 caliber, 50 caliber machine guns. The newer ships had 20 millimeter cannons, and or even anti-aircraft 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, but one gun, and it generally wasn't enough.
And not only that, but we
One or
actually
two.
saw it in the video clip, the cinematic that you showed earlier, the very first section where a pair of Ju-88 dive bombers attacked a merchantman. And I was quite surprised to see that they showed what the Ju-88 pilots actually did. The lead pilot would take the fire and would fake an attack to draw the fire away. And of course, the gunners would continue blazing away at the one target while the second one would come in and get the bombs away uninterrupted.
And you've got to bear in mind, it's not just that it's one or two guns. It's also one or two guns. They're not manned by frontline Navy crew trained in high-angle anti-aircraft defense. They don't have access to the latest fire control equipment. They don't have access to all that other kind of stuff. And again, bearing in mind the time period that this is happening in, the level of anti-aircraft defense effectiveness throughout the war goes up quite steeply. But it's not at that kind of late 43 to 44 level with VT fuses and all of that. It's nowhere near that at this point. And that's with full-on warships in large numbers. So having 2 merchant ships, 3 merchant ships, or 1 merchant ship, to be honest, the level of anti-aircraft defense you can offer hasn't really changed all that much. All you've done is offer the Luftwaffe 2 or 3 targets on a plate instead of having to go off looking for the others.
Yeah.
Actually, the situation was so bad for the merchant crews that when one freighter was stopping by to pick up survivors from the freighter Washington, actually the survivors in their lifeboats refused to be picked up because they figured out that in the lifeboat they actually have probably better chance of reaching safety than just landing just another freighter.
And I think in the case of the crew of the Washington, the lifeboats, they did. They managed to make it to the northern Russian coast where they were picked up by a group of Russian soldiers.
Yeah. There's a question from Karl Deseberger. Where was the Red Navy during the convoy? Well, that's one of the other big pain points of the Arctic convoys, because the Soviet Northern Fleet had at the beginning of the war only 8 destroyers, and only I think 3 of them were the new Project 7s, the Grebiaści and so on, and the rest were basically old World War I refurbished ships.
They were
but guys, back in that day, the Gremiashi could still stealth fire. She should have easily been able to take them out, right?
And all the Russian and Soviet ships were built for short-range actions.
Yeah,
more or less. So they didn't really have the legs to go too far from Kola, and they also had their hands kind of full along the coast, because they were providing fire support and doing a lot of small skirmishes and stuff like that. So for the convoy operations, they generally joined the convoys some like
120 miles.
Yeah,
at the most.
Yeah.
Well, you've got to bear in mind most of the Russian shipyards that are churning out, well, almost all of the Russian fleet, but especially their lighter escorts, they're mostly based in the Baltic and Black Seas, both of which are completely cut off pretty much from them being able to redeploy. And so you've got to bear in mind, when the Russians have X number of destroyers built, you've got to think, okay, so how many of those are in the Pacific? How many of those are in the Black Sea? How many of those are in the Baltic? And once you've taken into account all of those and how many are lost, etc., none of those are available for the Northern Fleet. So just because they have a certain number of destroyers doesn't mean they're actually available for these kind of operations, because if there's one thing the Germans are not going to let the Red Banner Fleet, they're not going to let them get out of around Denmark, because they control both sides of that particular strait, and they're definitely not going to let them sail all the way through the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles, across the Mediterranean and around the Atlantic.
Yeah.
So any destroyers that the Northern Fleet has, if it loses them, it ain't getting them replaced anytime soon.
So we can have a little look, because obviously once it became clear that something terrible happened with PQ17, I think some of the destroyers were actually sent out to go and try and collect what was left of the convoy and rescue survivors. So we've got like a little bit of some nice CGI, and then I think it's time to move on to questions soon.
Yeah, I think so.
From July 9th through July 11th, 5 merchantmen and several escort ships from PQ-17 arrived in Arkhangelsk, Nobody wanted to believe that only 1/7 of the vessels survived. Everyone still had hope. Those who went on search missions hoped to find the survivors. The people floating in boats and on rafts, frozen and exhausted, hoped they would be found. And they were found, almost all of them. Over the following 2 weeks, another 6 vessels arrived at Arkhangelsk, both towed and on their own power. When Convoy PQ17 left port, it included 35 merchant ships. Only 11 of them reached Soviet shores.
Yeah, and that was pretty much the end of Convoy PQ17. Out of 35 merchant ships, 11 made it through.
Yeah. Just out of interest, the commodore of the convoy, Dowding, his ship was sunk. He was picked up of water. He then organized getting the ships that survived and were hiding at Novaya Zemlya, getting them to Arkhangelsk. On his way back to the Iceland, his ship was again sunk. He was again picked up. And later in his career, he was organizing the naval transportations for the Operation Neptune for the Normandy landings. So he had kind of a lively career.
He had a busy job.
Yes.
Okay, so are you guys happy to move on to some of the questions that guys have sent in? Yeah?
Sure. I mean, we already covered some of them, but...
Yeah, that's true. We'll revisit them anyway. So, guys, if you don't know how this works, right, every month we're going to have the stream, usually on the last Friday of the month, but unfortunately, next Friday we are going to be on a boat having barbecue.
Yes.
Which... It fell on that date, so we had to move it, right? But we will always publish an article about this stream the week before, announcing the week's topic, the next stream's topic, and sending you out a little survey where you can ask questions. And then the guys in the week afterwards pick their favorite questions, the ones that they think are interesting, and then we'll discuss those on stream. We'll, of course, also have some questions from chat, so if you have questions, I'll kind of add them to the queue and we can discuss them. There was one earlier, by the way. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but what do you guys think of Greyhound? The movie.
I haven't seen it yet. I'd love to see it,
Yeah.
but I'm not paying Apple. I'm not signing up for yet another streaming service. I've already got Netflix, Amazon
Okay.
Prime, so I'll just wait.
What he said.
The same issue here. Yeah.
Okay, so nobody's seen it, guys. They don't have an opinion on it, apart from that we don't like Apple streaming service. Okay, so question number 1 was sent in by Tsar Nicholas II, who's asking, how were Arctic Convoys named? Did the name depend on the direction the convoy is going? Easy one.
Yes.
Yes, it did.
Well, we already covered that some of the initials were just picked basically semi-randomly from whatever people felt like picking at the time, but the general principle, not just on the Arctic convoys but on a lot of convoys, including the Atlantic convoys, was that once you had an initial set picked, you just flip those initials around to the convoy returning the other way.
Yes. So basically for the Arctic convoys, first it was PQ and QP. PQ Iceland, Russia, QP Russia, Iceland or Scotland. But after PQ17 and PQ18, it was felt that for one, the name is getting a bit too transparent, and for two, it's kind of like a bad luck name already. So a random group of letters was selected, and it was JW for Russia and RA for the return trip.
Okay. There's a question here from Bogsy Time in Twitch chat, who's, I think we touched on already, but what kind of min-max thinking goes into the decision to abandon a convoy worth so much when such an enormous escorting force exists? I think we touched on this earlier, right? And the various, if you want to give a quick recap.
Well, I think we're going to be expanding on the reasons why, or the political reasons why in another question that we'll be looking at later. But they assumed that the Tirpitz was literally right over the horizon. So too far away, or at least the convoy assumed from the signals that they'd received, that the Tirpitz was right over the horizon and was going to start shooting them at any second, which is what made sense of the signal for the light escorts, the cruisers, to withdraw to the west, and then for the convoy to scatter. Yeah.
So
that, however, was not the case.
Yeah, so basically, to just answer the min-maxing question, I mean, it's a bit game term, but so basically the idea was to scatter the convoy to make it as hard as possible for the Tirpitz to sink it quickly, and to at least make it lose time while doing so, while the close escort and the distant escort would basically consolidate into the battle force and come back to slap torpedoes.
Yes.
That's basically what went through all the commanders on the spot, what went through their heads.
And you've also got to bear in mind that the time involved, because if you've got the heavy forces 300 miles behind, bearing in mind that the convoy's still going east, even if although those following ships pile on the speed and head over, you're talking a day and a half, 2 days to catch up. So if you think Tirpitz it's not even a case of if you think Tirpitz is over the horizon. Obviously the convoy did think that, but even if you think Tirpitz is a day away, that's pretty much the same thing as far as whether or not the heavy ships can come and help you.
Tirpitz did what, almost 30 knots if they pushed it?
30 knots,
Yeah, 30 plus, depending on the weather, obviously.
The merchant ships did 10.
10.
Yeah, 10, 12 on a good day. And also you've got to bear in mind that the Allied escorts, the heavy escorts, on paper, they're slightly slower than Tirpitz already. They're designed for 27, 28 knots. And we are talking, as powerful as it was, the Washington and its sister ship did have quite a lot of problems actually maintaining their speed without vibrating their sterns off. So you're actually talking about a combined heavy escort closing speed, unless you really want to arrive with half your stuff broken, of probably around about 25 knots, which just extends your travel time even further.
Okay. So let's move on to question 2. It's from Barkham Squirrel, and he's asking, with the convoys, how much did ice buildup of the main guns, secondary, and AA affect the ship's ability to fight?
Yeah,
a lot.
Basically, if you didn't stay on top of it, it would get on top of you, and you could potentially lose the ship. Never mind lose your ability to fight. But yeah, as we mentioned earlier, in particular with HMS Trinidad, Crown Colony class light cruiser. Same class as HMS Fiji in game right now at tier 7, one of the best ships in the game. That ended up torpedoing itself after only managing to get one of its torpedoes away because they hadn't brought enough antifreeze for the journey, and their torpedo launchers iced up. Serious structural problems. The superstructure can only take a certain amount of weight before it snaps off. And then, of course, all of that weight high up in the ship, the higher up in the ship the weight is, the less weight is required to cause the ship to capsize. So it's extremely dangerous and has to be dealt with.
And when you've got weights high in the ship, once a ship does start to capsize, they accelerate the process.
Yeah.
So it's much harder to come back from it. Paradoxically, actually, when it comes to the guns, the heavier guns are slightly less vulnerable to the icing up because they'll all ice up at roughly the same rate. If you're talking a 6-inch gun or an 8-inch gun on a heavy cruiser or bigger on the battleships, proportionally there's less surface area. And you also, if you chip off enough ice between the turret motors and the shock of the guns firing, anything that's really much left is going to get blown off by the first couple of salvos. And you can hit the stuff pretty hard to get it off, and you will need to because the ice is pretty thick. Whereas if you've got a 20 millimeter, say, an Oerlikon, you can't just take a shovel and start pounding on the barrel to get the ice off because you're just going to break things. And also there tend to be a lot more of them. So it's actually a lot harder to keep your light guns serviceable in that kind of environment as compared to your heavies, albeit, as Jingles pointed out, the weight is another factor. And obviously the bigger the gun, the just a sheer amount of ice on there at that point. So you have to keep everything clear, even though your combat effectiveness on different batteries may be somewhat different.
Okay. Cool. Next question from Nothia? I don't know. What was the greatest threat to the Arctic convoys? Was it the cold or the submarines?
And we have basically the same question also from BLJ 2019 from NA. So
Okay. Well, I think one kind of leads to the other. I'd say, again, if we're min-maxing the answer, I'd say the submarines were a bigger threat than the cold, because the cold wasn't going to be that much of a problem because you're inside a nice toasty warm ship until you get torpedoed, and then the cold is probably what's going to kill you. So, I mean, they were both an issue. Don't forget, most warships at this time didn't have covered bridges. Insane that may be for ships that are regularly sailing into the teeth of Arctic gales, but that's just the way it was. So it wasn't pleasant being on these ships on the Arctic routes, but the cold wasn't going to kill you until you'd already been hit by the submarine. I mean, you could ask the question: was it the cold? Was it the submarines? Or was it the Luftwaffe? The Luftwaffe, depending on the time of day or the time of year, was a bigger threat than the submarines. But the cold was probably only going to kill you once either the Luftwaffe or the U-boats had already done their dirty work.
Basically, that's also taking the PQ17 as example. With many ships that were sunk, actually the only losses directly from the sinking were the engine room crew, the engine watch, which was usually 3 to 5 people. Which is also why generally for all the destruction, the Convoy PQ17 wasn't that heavy in the loss of life for the Allies.
Although also vaguely related to the subject, amongst the ships, excuse me.
Oh God, Jingles.
Need to cut this stuff out. Among the ships that scattered, they all scattered, and it was down to the captains of the individual ships which courses they were going to take, and there were a couple that decided they were going to try to take their chances in the pack ice, because that would give them a better chance, not only keep them further away from any aircraft that might spot them, but also submarines tend not to like to sail around underwater in areas where there are massive icebergs, 9/10 of which are below the surface. And not all of them made it through the pack ice unscathed, because icebergs and growlers are just as big a hazard as mines. So in some cases, the cold was actually their biggest threat.
Okay. While you're here, Dylan Boyer on YouTube is asking, he's saying, well, first of all, he loves your content, Jingles, and he has a question. Based on your experience, what would you say it was like for the people providing naval support to PQ17?
The people providing naval support in what?
You know, like, I think the sailors he's talking about. What was it like, like serving?
Well, it was different for me. I have done towed array patrols in the Greenland ice and UK Gap, right up there in the the cold northern end of the world, but I wasn't serving on a tiny little corvette that bounces around in a wet puddle with fairly primitive facilities. I was serving on modern, modern when I was on them at least, Type 22 frigates, which don't let the name frigate fool you. In the US Navy, a frigate was another word for what the US Navy would refer to as a destroyer escort, or basically a corvette-sized ship. Type 22 frigates about the same size as a town-class cruiser. I mean, they were big old ships, and they were quite comfortable to serve on. It still wasn't pleasant when you're in the teeth of an Arctic gale, but it wasn't anything like what those people must have experienced during World War II. So I'm not really qualified to answer that question. I had a taste of what it was like, enough to know that I wouldn't have liked to have done it in a World War II ship. Okay. Absolutely not. Nothing but respect for those who did, particularly the military who weren't even in warships.
I was reading a book on the Little Ayrshires convoy in preparation for this stream, and the commander of the Navy Armed Guard on one of the freighters that took the route through the ice pack was basically saying that the first time he slept actually in his bunk, in the ship, in the warmth, and actually in the pajamas, not in full uniform, was when they arrived to Russia, because like before that he was just sleeping right under the gun and
Yeah, horrible conditions.
Speaking of that, there was a question from Tim Mateos on Twitch, and he was asking what kind of merchant ships were actually used. Was it all US supplied Liberty ships, or
all sorts of ships?
If only it had been US supplied Liberty ships, it wouldn't have been quite as bad. I mean, the Liberty ships weren't built with comfort in mind, but they worked. They were reliable. They got the job done. No, we were talking tramp steamers from pre-World War I. Anything could be pressed into service was used. I mean, most of the ships were older than their crews. It was ridiculous.
Yeah. For example, the one of the freighters, the steamship Troubadour, was initially Italian. When USA joined the war, Italian crew sabotaged it. They tried to fry up the boilers. The US Coast Guard managed to stop it, but the boilers had some lasting damage. So the ship was able to do 8 knots on a good day. It was coal burning. It had a crew that was basically a mix of all sorts of people who actually did a little mutiny while waiting for the convoy on Iceland. And like it was very, very suboptimal ship to run this route. And it's kind of miraculous that it survived both the way there and the way back.
Okay. So let's have a look at the next question. So again from Tsar Nicholas II. He's asking, how much did the extreme cold temperature affect steel brittleness, and if increased armor penetration vulnerability of the German battleship hulls and or gun barrel or wear performance of firing? Say with U-boat hull and the vulnerability to depth charges, did the cold make the ships more prone to break?
It could do. It depended on the steel quality. The era, I mean, ships that are made of steel are always going to be vulnerable to extremes of temperature. By the time of World War II, even with the older ships, we have moved on a little bit from the 19th century, where mostly using iron, there was huge variability, whether you were in tropical waters, North Sea waters, or Arctic waters. But there was still some sort of increase in the brittleness, but especially, weirdly enough, with a few more modern merchant ships that were present, with the welding, because welding was not it wasn't the precise science it would later become, and with the best will in the world, the best welders that they had were assigned to building warships in most cases. So that a welded merchant hull in the Arctic would be at a significantly increased risk of either just suffering weather damage that would open up the seams, or the actual damage from an attack might spread a lot further, a lot worse along that hull than it would in other waters. When it comes to the warships themselves, they have the advantage of mass behind them, and also it's kind of an equal opportunities thing, so it's going to have slightly less effect on battleships slugging it out than it is on merchant ships. And with the U-boats, weirdly enough, although they are underwater and it's the Arctic, the overall temperature of the ocean itself is not going to be 20 below, if you're talking Celsius. Whereas if you're on the surface, between wind chill and the air and everything, that is actually where it's colder. So the U-boats of all the ships present are actually the least affected by the cold, unless of course they happen to surface.
Yeah,
It's
generally the armor wouldn't be really affected much, even on the surface ships, because basically, again, it's concentrated around waterline, so it has fairly stable temperature. What would be affected by the brittleness the most are like the upper works and various not armored but iron parts, like basically equipment, derricks and all sorts of stuff.
Because funny enough, I seem to remember watching a video on YouTube from somebody, I can't remember his name, talking about late 19th century ironclads suffering significant problems because the armor brittleness was tested in firing ranges alongside on land.
Yes.
And this armor's fantastic. And then you put it on a ship in the cold water, and suddenly everybody's surprised when the armor starts shattering.
Yeah, it's I better stop myself before I go off on one of my little engineering rants. But there's all sorts of wonderful phase shift and phase change tables and solidus lines and all this kind of fancy transition phases. But that's it affects iron a lot worse than steel. Where those transitions occur depends greatly on the alloy that you're using. And remember, steel is an alloy. It's iron and carbon at its core, but with obviously random trace elements and such, like depending on what particular type it is. So
we've got him started now.
It's kind of a front
I start reaching for my complicated graphs.
But there was a question here from Josh Thomas Moore. He was asking, how different was an Arctic convoy to an Atlantic convoy?
Colder,
and you were at more risk of air attack.
Yes,
basically permanently. The major threat to the Atlantic convoys were the U-boats. The major threat to the Arctic convoys were the U-boats, the cold, the Luftwaffe, and the surface raiders. So
the sun or the dark.
Yeah.
So rougher. I think rougher. And this is a complex one. I have no idea. Angelos Triandos is saying, "Hi, should the Admiralty have waited for more details from Bletchley Park because the first Sea Lord had a meeting with Norman Denning, who said to wait?" I have no idea who any of those people are.
Pass. Don't know.
Likely they should have waited for the confirmation, but basically the entire decision was taken by Sir Dudley Pound, and he died shortly thereafter, so he didn't really have much opportunity to explain his exact reasoning at that moment.
One of the things you've got to remember is that when we have most of the facts, it's relatively easy to lay it out in hindsight and go, well, this is where Tirpitz was, this is where the Allies' escorts were, this is what happened, this is what should have happened. But you've got to remember they had a fraction of that information, and when you weigh up the balance of possibilities based on what they knew at the time, the possibility was that Tirpitz and its escort group gets into the convoy, at which point not only do you lose all the convoy, you probably also lose a bunch of the escorts. And as we covered at the top of it, at this point you can't really afford, it might be a valiant last stand, but you can't afford to lose a half flotilla of destroyers and a half squadron of cruisers in a valiant last stand at this point if you can avoid doing so.
And lose the convoy as well.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't actually benefit you get at that in the overall strategic situation at the time. So you've got to make a decision, and you've got to make a decision quickly. And in this case, obviously, that means that decision was made without as much information as potentially they could have done, which would have probably led to a different decision. But it would be a very brave man to sit there going, well, as far as we know, Tirpitz is getting closer and closer and closer, and I'm just going to sit here, wait, and see what happens, because for all you know, the next message that might come through is enemy battleship in sight bearing 175 engaging, and that might be the last thing you hear from several thousand Royal Navy servicemen.
Yeah. Okay, let's go on. Question number 6 from Vesuvius, who was saying, if Tirpitz had sorted even somewhat regularly, do you think it would have encountered any kind of success against the Arctic convoys, or do you think she would have met the same fate as Scharnhorst? Now we get into speculatory territory. Yes. I like it. Jingles.
It could have gone either way. It depends on the situation. I mean, Tirpitz came. If it hadn't been for the presence of, was it the Victorious, the carrier?
Yes.
In the distant covering force? If it hadn't been for the presence of the Victorious, there's every chance that Tirpitz and her escorts would have come out to fight. And at that point, all bets are off. Without the Victorious, would the heavy covering force, the Duke of York and the USS Washington, have been able to deal with them? Probably. But maybe not.
To chase them.
Yes. If Tirpitz had been sallying out regularly, that puts Tirpitz at increased risk of being ambushed and intercepted and sunk. And the one thing that the Germans wanted to avoid at all costs was losing the Tirpitz. If there was the slightest risk that the ship was going to be lost, they just turned around, or they didn't even bother sailing. So
there's also a problem with the regular sailing that's called fuel.
Yeah.
Because Tirpitz sailed in March. It sailed around, didn't find anything, returned. But this sortie burned so much fuel that basically it took 3 months to replenish it. So basically, Tirpitz was trying to sail as often as it could, but that was like, well, okay, you sail now you wait 3 months.
But it needed solid intelligence to make it worth sailing. And solid intelligence wasn't always easy to get. I mean, they usually spotted the convoys at some point, but often they wouldn't spot the convoys and be in a position to attack at a time when it was convenient for the Tirpitz to come out and actually catch up with them.
Yes.
And you've also got to factor into account that even if somehow the Germans somehow manage to get their hands on infinite fuel so the Tirpitz can sortie whenever it wants, there's also, with regularity comes predictability.
Yeah.
Although we're only about halfway through World War II at this point, the Allies, with the Americans joining in, do have an overwhelming superiority of resources if they can bring them to bear. And the more predictable Tirpitz becomes in its operational pattern, the more the Allies can justify devoting rather significant resources to ambushing it in many ways, not just the heavy surface force, but also in terms of, and whether or not it would have been effective, who knows, but in terms of lining up a number of submarines on its outward bound and inbound course, because even if you miss it on the outbound course, it's got to come back. There's only so many ways back home.
And you can just comment on the fact they were constantly mining the approaches. The Germans were constantly sweeping the approaches. It was a continuous effort both ways.
So one second. So there's Show Guy Games was asking why didn't they just send the cruisers and the destroyers out then if they were so worried about turpits?
Send the cruisers and destroyers out to attack the turpits.
No. The turpits escort force.
Oh.
So if they the problem is that if you send out just the light forces, so maybe anything up to the size of a Deutschland class, the covering forces that the Allies can put together in terms of cruiser squadrons can handle that.
Yeah.
The Battle of the River Plate at the beginning of the war has showed very with a very tight margin, but just what you needed to handle a Deutschland.
Yeah.
And that, bear in mind, that's the Leanders and York class, which are the diminutives of the counties and the towns, and it's the counties and the towns that are running the cruiser covering force. So if you have, let's say, Lützow and Hipper show up, if the Allies have covered that with 2 or 3 heavy cruisers, a couple of light cruisers, and a flotilla of destroyers, they'll quite happily accept those odds.
Yeah.
And the carriers and the battleships can be off doing something else.
That's actually exactly what happened at the end of at the beginning of 1943 or end of 1942, with the renewed JW series of convoys in the Battle of Barents Sea. The Lützow and Hipper were intercepting a convoy, and basically it all ended when arriving cruisers from the covering force managed to plant first salvo on Hipper, managed to damage the engine room, and that was just like so much risk suddenly, because I mean the Allies can kind of afford having, for example, a light cruiser crippled next to the convoy because it would get help there, but the Kriegsmarine cannot afford to have a cruiser crippled in the middle of enemy formation. It's like,
I mean, don't forget, and this was worth repeating, one of you mentioned it earlier, I can't remember who, so I apologize, but these are raiders, right? We all play World of Warships. We think the Admiral Hipper, heavy cruiser, get in there and fight, you know, you're a heavy. It was a raider. Its job wasn't to tangle with cruiser escorts and destroyer escorts. Its job was to avoid cruiser escorts and destroyer escorts and sink merchantmen.
Mm-hmm.
So any battle where you've got the German raiders mixing it up with Allied escorts, the German raiders have already lost, regardless of the actual numbers of ships that get sunk on each side, because their mission has been killed.
Yeah, Germany can't reproduce ships really at this point, right? So every loss is a permanent loss.
Exactly,
Yes.
and even heavy damage, because Norway doesn't have the world's biggest shipyard. So if it's really bad damage, you've somehow got to get it back to Norway, and then you've also got to somehow get it all the way back to Germany, most likely. I mean, even back when the Kriegsmarine was being a lot more aggressive, back in the very early part of the war, obviously you've got the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau managed to sink HMS Glorious. Now on paper, that's a huge victory. You've taken out a carrier, a couple of destroyers, but by the time the 2 ships get home, between a Castor's torpedo and a Lucky Mine, both of Germany's capital ships are out of action. The British have lost a carrier. They have half a dozen more. Germany's completely out of capital ships at that point until they can repair them. And that actually results in the admiral who was in charge of that operation being replaced by one Gunther Lütjens, who would then be the one who took Bismarck out under substantially more risk-averse orders. So, I mean, that both informs sort of this imbalance of, even if you win the tactical battle, you might lose strategically, but also that particular incident and that relief of command is going to be playing on the German commanders' minds, because if they see, oh, we're going to confront this Allied escort force, it's not just can we win against this force, it's will I have a command when I get home? Because even if I come back with my ship relatively intact with a bunch of shot holes in it, no matter what I've done, there's a very good chance I'm going to be off the ship.
Yeah. And there was a question from Killabin. He's asked it twice, actually. Killabin, I saw it. I'm not sure if we can elaborate much on this, but he's asking how much can Admiral Pound's brain tumor to be considered to be a serious issue?
Well, it's not going to help, is it?
yeah, but again, it's debatable.
Yeah, we just don't know. It could have had a serious effect on the man's thinking, but it might not, and there's absolutely no way of knowing one way or the other.
Yeah.
To be honest, the single biggest sort of external factor, if you like, on his thinking is probably going to be the ridiculous amount of hours he was doing at that point.
Yes.
As same with the Atlantic convoys, actually, the Germans don't do a 9 to 5 and then everyone gets to go home to sleep. The Germans are going to be attacking whenever and wherever they can, as much as close to 24/7 as possible. And even the possibility that they're going to attack at any given point means that the people who have appointed themselves to look after the convoys back home are pretty much either awake or on their toes 24/7, and that has a detrimental impact over time on your ability to think clearly and make decisions.
So there was also a question from Serentinum. He wanted to know, how did surface raiders actually deal with the convoys? Did they just sink them with guns, or would they go and board them and sink them afterwards to save the life of sailors, or maybe like loot valuables?
And entirely on how big a clutch of ships they'd come across. If they were in the middle of the South Atlantic, for example, where the water was nice and warm and there weren't that many naval bases for thousands of miles in any direction and the cruiser patrols were few and far between, then yeah, they'd probably point their guns at them, make loud threatening noises, go on board, replenish whatever supplies they had, take prisoners on board and then sink the ship, which is what the early war surface raiders did. I'm pretty sure that the Graf Spee did pretty much exactly that. The SMS Emden in the First World War did pretty much exactly that. If you happen across a big fat juicy convoy that's threatening to scatter, then you just sink as many ships as you can as quickly as you can before they get out of range. And somebody asked in chat, I noticed it on Twitch earlier, I'm sorry I can't remember your name, exactly how far away is visual range at sea anyway? At about 20 miles, you can see the top of the mast of an enemy ship over the horizon with a good pair of binoculars.
That's far.
There's Josh Thomas Moore on YouTube. You mentioned the two forces ships passing 60 miles apart from each other. Was the Arctic especially bad for locating other ships? During the Arctic night, yes, because basically you don't have sun. You have a permanent darkness. You have some glow along the horizon that shows you roughly where the sun might be hiding, but you don't have a daylight. So
and that's assuming that the weather is otherwise clear and calm. You've got to bear in mind
in winter in the North Atlantic it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, referencing another battle in the Arctic region, the Battle of the North Cape, whilst Duke of York used its radar on Scharnhorst, you've got to remember Scharnhorst got down to 12,000 yards before Duke of York illuminated it and opened fire. Scharnhorst had no clue the Duke of York was there, and that's a 35,000-ton battleship at what's effectively point-blank range for the period. So you could literally be sailing within the equivalent of punching distance and not have the first clue that someone was out there if you didn't have the right systems.
Basically the only... Yeah.
Sorry, I was again a further example. Right after HMS Trinidad had torpedoed herself, a couple of the friendly British destroyers arrived. One hung around to make sure that the Trinidad was okay. The other HMS Eclipse took off in pursuit after the Z-46. Z-46, sorry, Z-26.
26.
Was getting the better of Z-26 when suddenly the Z-24 and Z-25 appeared out of the mist 2 kilometers away and turned the tables on the Eclipse, who was forced to run away. And unfortunately, the weather took that precise moment to suddenly get better, and she could be seen for miles. So yeah, the weather could have a massive effect, and it could change like that.
The same happened, for example, during the Battle of the Barents Sea, again after Hipper and Lutzow retreated. 2 German destroyers actually approached the HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica, thinking that they are friendly ships because the visibility was just so poor that they found their mistake only when they were under a deluge of 6-inch shells. So that was
there were a number of different occasions, and it occurred during PQ17 and PQ18 where they only realized they were facing enemy surface ships when they had challenged them with flashing light and asked them to identify themselves.
And you've got to remember as well, over the scale that these engagements are taking place at, bearing in mind gun ranges multiple miles, even going into double digits, when you've got all these ships scattered out, it's not just a case of the weather is this. It may be that the weather for a destroyer that's 2 miles off the stern of the convoy is complete non-visibility. The weather at the other end of the convoy might be perfectly clear, and there'd be a sort of a bank of fog or snow or sleet or whatever halfway down, and this will be replicated in patches all over the place. So you can have ships appear, disappear, one ship might be perfectly visible, the next ship might be completely hidden.
So you're saying World of Warships spotting is historically accurate?
Plus, there's also, especially when the sea was calm, which actually it was in the case of PQ17, that's a point that many of the participants took, that basically the sea was completely flat like a glass. That made it actually hell for submarines initially, because like you can see the periscope from miles away. But there was also the polar mirage. Basically, over this huge flat cold surface, you had a lot of optical illusions. So, for example, when the corvette HMS Lotus returned back to search for survivors of the convoy, they actually spotted a life raft at several miles thanks to the mirage, while the sailors on the life raft were thinking that they are basically lost because the smoke cans they popped, the smoke was just spreading across the water, but the mirage saved them. So basically you have all sorts of weird things happening at these places.
Yeah. There was a question I found quite interesting from Bene 1994 was asking, why did the Allies not use more carriers in the Arctic to fill the air cover gap instead of sending them to the Atlantic where there was no German air power?
Well, carriers aren't just for providing air cover and defending against air attack, because the single best way of spotting a submarine, which was the major threat in the Atlantic, is with an aircraft. The aircraft can see, obviously they're higher up, so they've got I mean, somebody was saying, what's visual range at sea? And I said 20 miles. It's 20 miles if you're on the surface. It can be 60 miles if you're 1,000 feet up. And you can see, the submarine cannot travel on the surface if there are aircraft overhead, because you'll see the wake from miles away, which the presence of aircraft over the Atlantic convoys meant that submarines were forced to stay submerged during the day, which cut their speed down by 2/3, which was a massive factor in preventing them from getting into position and attacking convoys in the first place. So yeah, I'm sure they would have loved to have had carriers for everyone, but they just didn't have enough, and they needed them everywhere.
Yeah, and it's also about the utility of operation, because I mean, the Atlantic's not exactly a pleasant place to be operating in, but compared to the Arctic, it's a walk in the park. All these issues that we've talked about with visibility of ships, they apply pretty much to aircraft as well, because if you could launch an aircraft in the middle of a nice, calm, clear, open day, but if that aircraft goes off 100 miles away, comes back and discovers the entire convoy and its carrier is now covered in a 300-foot high bank of fog, what's it going to do? It can't land, it can't see anything, and yeah, good luck surviving if you have to ditch if you're wearing pilot gear in the middle of the Arctic, and that's without the storms render your carrier pretty much non-operational, because it's doing this all the time, which is not really conducive for flying off. You've got the ice. The ice is going to affect aircraft even worse than it's going to affect ship structures, so you can't really keep the aircraft out on deck, as assuming you don't get them washed or blown off. Even if you have them in the carrier itself, you bring them up onto deck. If the deck's covered in ice, well, good luck taking off or indeed landing. And as we mentioned, the Germans have significantly more aircraft present, which means that whereas out in the middle of the Atlantic, you can put swordfish and all sorts of things, and they'll quite happily take chunks out of the U-boat fleet all day. If you send a couple of unescorted swordfish or albacores up west of Bear Island, the Germans are just going to show up with Messerschmitts and shoot down your aircraft. You've only got limited numbers on your carrier.
They don't even have to show up with Messerschmitts. They can turn up in a Ju-88 and it's still going to get the job done.
That'd be an interesting dogfight. I think an HE-115 would probably stand a decent chance against an albacore.
Yes, definitely. And there's also a question of what carriers, because basically fleet carriers, you can't really tie them to the convoy because they are just too juicy a target for submarines. Yeah. So they have to stay with the distant cover and actually cover the distant cover against planes and submarines. But escort carriers, at that time of war, they were mostly improvised. They were not yet the custom-built boat class and
Kaiser
stuff.
coffins, jeep carriers. Yes.
And for example, the which one was it with PQ-18 Argus? No, Avenger carried only 8 planes, I believe.
Yeah.
So basically, that's not enough to provide combat air patrol against bombers. So the carrier is basically a sitting duck against enemy air raid. all you can do is basically send out the swordfishes to chase submarines. But that's it.
Yeah, and even if by some magical chance you've somehow lucked into having 8 Hellcats or 8 Wildcats, or Martlets as they would have been called at the time, again, you're sailing off the coast of an occupied country where there's a lot of Luftwaffe aircraft. Even if you've got 8 of the best naval fighters available at the period, the Germans can show up with 24
or 200.
and that's it.
Okay, let's move. Guys, I can see lots of questions on Twitch. We'll do a few more of the questions you guys submitted, and then we'll move back and chat to you guys in chat, right? So, Captain J is asking, what was the state of ultra intercepts at this point in the war? Sure, by mid-20, if 1942, they were reading some Enigma messages or not?
Some is a keyword.
German naval Enigma was the one that was the hardest to keep cracking and keep track of. The German naval Enigma, remember, was the one that introduced the additional rotor.
Yeah.
German
rotors? Was it 4 rotors instead of
4
3?
rotors? Yeah. The German, although German signal security wasn't the best due to some of the blind spots they had about being convinced that Enigma was near enough uncrackable, of the various German military commands, the German naval signal security was probably a step above that of the army and the Luftwaffe. So by 42, you're getting some message intercepts, but when you're getting them, both in terms of if you're getting them at all and also how long it's taking you to decode them, it's a little bit of a potluck.
The speed of decoding, don't be fooled into thinking that, okay, we've cracked the code, run it through the computer, and 4 minutes later it spits out a transcript of a decoded message. No, it would still take many, many hours. Even if you had fragments of the cipher, it would take many, many hours for the, it was bizarre actually, they called the
bomb.
The bomb. They called them the bombs. Yeah. That was the name they used for the computers, massive analog computers that they used to actually decode these things, which the Americans, once they got in on the act, industrialized on a massive scale and proved to be far better at decrypting than we could ever be, just because we couldn't build as many things as many of the things as the Americans could. An often overlooked part of the success of decrypting German signals intelligence was where the signals intelligence wasn't actually being decrypted at all. But Drac alluded briefly to communications discipline. Often you could tell because
they'd start and finish the messages with the same things, right? Sometimes just finish everything or finish with Heil Hitler, or start with the weather's clear, and
the messages that they were sent, once they'd been grouped up, were sent via Morse code, and you could recognize an individual operator by the way they sent that Morse code. So if you knew what somebody sounded like, if you knew that the radio operator on the Tirpitz was sending, there was a fairly good reason that the Tirpitz was up to something. A fairly good reason. You could make a fairly educated guess that the Tirpitz was up to something. And just the volume of signal traffic that was being generated from certain sources, if you knew where it was coming from, and there was a sudden massive increase in signal traffic in Trondheim, for example, it's entirely possible that the German destroyer force was up to something. You didn't need to actually be able to decrypt the message in order to get an awful lot of information from just the raw signal data itself.
And if you had such buildup of message traffic and then suddenly silence, that means that something is really, really hanging right over you.
Okay. Yep. Next question was, why did PQ17 fail so badly, and could there have been something been done about this? Well, I think why we've gone into the why.
I think we touched it. Yeah.
Okay. Now, Drachinifel, you're the admiral in charge. What would you have done to do it better?
Well, as I say, the problem is how much information do you actually have to hand? Especially with these kind of counterfactuals, it's incredibly difficult to make the call. In some circumstances, it's much easier, because in some circumstances, the admiral in charge or whoever has a lot of information to hand, they just interpret it wrong, or they actually make a call that's relatively speaking correct, and luck goes against them. With this, there's so little information they actually have at the time, and it's so scattered that to try and second guess at any given point, even hour by hour, how it's how you could realistically change things is always going to be changing on that constant basis. And I mean, yeah, in theory, you might say, well, actually, we should just press the big heavy escorts. We should just take them with us further. Then even if Tirpitz shows up, doesn't matter really. We'll fight it and hope that we should win with the preponderance of force we've got. But this, if you're a really aggressive admiral, you might think, yeah, I'll do this, but then you're going to get hauled onto the carpet by your superiors, saying to you, well, why on earth did you just send 2 battleships and a carrier into the teeth of the Luftwaffe? Because it's not just a case of we will do this to secure against Tirpitz, it's what are the Germans going to do in response? And it may not even be something they do in response. It may be something as relatively mundane as, yeah, we'll keep Victorious in near company for longer, and then Luftwaffe Ju-88 wandering along looking for a convoy, looking for something to attack, gets lost in cloud, can't find anything, wonders what's going on, pops out of a cloud, finds itself sitting right above Victorious. Now what? This is the kind of stuff that can happen in this kind of environment. It's
look at Bismarck.
To be honest, Bismarck is the whole operation there is so much easier to counterfactual than the Arctic convoys, because as the amount of variables in play and the amount of information that we know the various officers had to hand is a lot more stable. With the Arctic convoys, as I say, I wouldn't want to try and second guess them purely on the basis that anything I say, you could easily say, well, yeah, but if you made that call an hour earlier, that'd be the wrong call. Or if you made that call at that time, how are you making that call? Because you don't actually have that information until 3 hours down the line.
Okay. There's also the fact that basically the Tirpitz returned. I think we will get to it in the next question, like exactly how it returned. But it returned for one because it was spotted, but also because by that time the recon planes reported that the convoy is scattering. So like the German high command realized that like it doesn't make sense to have Tirpitz chasing after single ships.
Yeah. Although we do have another expert handy who so far hasn't had a chance to answer a question. Alexa, what went wrong with Convoy PQ17? Alexa doesn't appear to have an opinion on the subject. Let me ask her again.
I don't know that.
What use are you, Alexa? Seriously, come on. Never mind.
She was so talkative earlier.
She was so talkative earlier.
Yes.
Alexa, tell me about Convoy PQ17.
This might answer your question. According to Wikipedia, a convoy is a group of vehicles, typically motor vehicles or ships,
Alexa,
traveling together.
Shut up.
Okay. Let's move on in the program.
Yes.
Next question is from Sound and Fury. And he's saying, it has been speculated.
Alexa. Women.
So, it has been speculated in Soviet literature that Tirpitz was forced to turn around and return to port after being torpedoed by sub K-21. As far as I understand, the evidence is quite firm that this is not what happened, but could you comment on what are the most convincing arguments that make this speculation false? Also, how likely would it be for a Soviet sub, or a World War II era sub in general, to score torpedo hits on a fast and modern ship like Tirpitz in that situation? That's a question and a half.
Well, the evidence that it didn't happen is, well,
absence of hole.
Yeah, the Tirpitz stayed operational and stayed in Norway. If Tirpitz had been hit by one or more torpedoes, there were not the facilities at its anchorage at that point to make anything like adequate repairs to keep it an operational frontline warship. It would have had to be relocated. And there's absolutely 0% in the Germans hiding that, because what they're going to do, they're going to keep a half-crippled battleship sitting in a fjord as a paperweight for a while. At this point, they've still got a number of other heavy ships that pose a threat. So they, well, not that they'd want to, but they can and would have taken it either further south or all the way back to Germany for repairs, depending on exactly how bad it was, whether it hit right amidships on the torpedo defense system, whether it hit somewhere slightly more vulnerable. So the fact that Tirpitz stayed around is pretty much the opening and closing argument for whether or not it got hit by a Russian torpedo. But on the flip side, whether or not that could, in theory, have happened from any sub, yeah, it definitely can, because
You just have to be lucky, right?
you just have
go
to
in
be
the
in the right-
submarine,
yeah,
Turbot's
right-
driving past, and you're going to shoot torpedoes.
Yeah, right
Happened
place,
in-
right time, and also you've got to bear in mind what exactly is Tirpitz doing, because it might be modern and fast, but if it's cruising along 18, 20 knots, nice straight line, trying to get home in good time, if you're in the right place in the right time, for a submarine commander, that's a dream shot. It's dead easy.
Yes.
If Tirpitz knows you're there and it's now going high speed and zigzag, that's a completely different matter, but Tirpitz wouldn't have been expecting that.
And
Yeah,
you
look
can
what
accuse
happened
the
to the
Germans.
Japanese fleet carriers when, there was a submarine just happened to be there.
You can accuse the Germans of a lot of things, but being stupid generally wasn't one of them, and they were fully aware of exactly when the Tirpitz was most vulnerable to torpedo attack, and would probably, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would have been astonished if they hadn't taken measures to safeguard against it. I mean, that they would have had a submarine net across the mouth of the fjord where the Tirpitz was laid up. There would have been patrols out sweeping for submarines. It wouldn't have been easy, but then again, it wasn't easy to sneak into Scapa Flow and sink the Royal Oak, and yet they still managed to do it. So not out of the question, but highly unlikely.
But on the other hand, what the K-21 did achieve, I mean, the torpedo attack was unsuccessful, but she sent a sighting report, which is even probably more important than the actual torpedo attack. Especially since while the Soviet Navy didn't really pass this sighting report along, the Germans didn't know this, and they detected sighting report. So okay, they know about us. Then Tirpitz was spotted by a flying boat from the RAF, and then by a British submarine. And all those two more sighting reports helped to convince the High Command that okay, they know about us. The convoy is scattering. Why should we risk Tirpitz?
Yeah.
Why would I scatter? I wouldn't scatter.
That's
was a bad choice.
something what the German commanders didn't understand really at all. That was like,
That you didn't get
why
that.
are they doing this?
Okay, let's move on. Next question. Guberio is asking, how much truth do you think there is in the common theory that the Admiralty's disastrous decision to scatter PQ17 and the almost panicked orders to do so was heavily influenced by the possibility that the first joint Anglo-American operation under British command might involve the destruction of American as well as British units?
I think it is likely that it was a factor. And Churchill also thought that it was a factor. In fact, I have what he had to say on the subject right here. Admiral Pound would probably not have sent...
Stop. Okay, if you're going to read Churchill, you're going to have to at least try and make an attempt at Churchill.
Admiral Pound would probably not have sent such vehement orders if only our own warships had been concerned. Is this good enough for you?
Excellent.
Yes, excellent.
But the idea that our first large joint Anglo-American operation under British command should involve the destruction of 2 United States cruisers as well as our own may well have disturbed the poise with which he was accustomed to deal with these heart-shaking decisions. So Churchill thought that it was a definite factor, and I don't know if it was the factor, but it was almost certainly something that influenced Pound's thinking. I mean, you had the Wichita and the Tuscaloosa in the distant covering force, not the heavy covering force. We had the USS Washington and the heavy covering force. They were both heavy cruisers. Wichita was one of the class. Tuscaloosa, I believe, was in New Orleans.
Yes.
You know,
the only New Orleans to survive 1942 without combat damage, by the way.
Wow. Yeah, because Dudley Pound ordered the ships to scatter. So, but yes, I'd say it was a factor. I don't think it was the factor, but it was certainly probably weighing quite heavily on his mind at the time.
Yeah, I would say he probably didn't really. The fact that the ships were American didn't really weigh as much on his mind as that. Basically, it would be 2 heavy cruisers lost.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah. I think it comes down to that. It's what ships are at risk in terms of what type of vessel, not necessarily the flag they're flying under, because if all of this had been happening 2 or 3 days earlier when there was a much greater chance of getting the heavy forces in, I don't think Admiral Pound would have blinked twice at sending Washington chasing after Tirpitz.
Oh, no, he would have leapt at the opportunity. That's exactly what the heavy covering force was for.
Yeah. So it's I think it's more about just as you say, there's a strong possibility of losing valuable heavy ships to heavy cruisers to little or no benefit. The fact that they are also American vessels is an additional complication, but it's not the primary one.
I think it would have been an additional complication that weighed more heavily on the politicians than the admirals, but then the admirals serve at the whim of the politicians, so in that respect, it would have been an influencing factor.
Okay. So we are at the end of our allotted stream time. I'm happy to keep going a little bit longer because I think we still have a few interesting questions to go through. But you guys happy? Yes?
Sure. I can't stick around for too much longer. I need to have my dinner. But yeah, we'll answer a few more.
Yep.
Okay. The jingles, when you get, you just send us subtle signals.
Yes.
We'll hear your stomach rumbling.
when I start chewing my own arm off, I'll probably need to go for a dinner break.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, next question. It's a long one again. I'm going to have to concentrate for this one. From Gamers Tank. So, after attempting to do my homework on this action, I wanted to ask you fine gentlemen 2 short questions. The heavy covering force covering the convoy included the aircraft carrier Victorious, battleships Duke of York and Washington, cruisers Cumberland and Nigeria, and 9 destroyers. Their position was northwest of Bear Island, in anticipation of resistance to the convoy's advance. Why didn't the Victorious launch fighters to provide cover when the German bombers, torpedo planes, and submarines arrived? My second question is, let's say all of the rumors behind the Tirpitz are true. The German Navy puts every ship at their disposal to attack the convoy. What are the chances of German success if the covering forces stay and fight it out?
Can I take the one about the Victorious launching fighters?
Yeah.
Yes.
350 miles away. What's the endurance of Grumman Martlet? And is it going to, and how many can it launch? Bearing in mind that the Luftwaffe were sending air raids of 80 aircraft at a time. To attack PQ17. So let's say that you are lucky enough to arrive over the convoy with your fighters at the precise moment when it's under attack, which you would need to be because you wouldn't have the endurance to hang around waiting for an air attack to develop, and you'd be largely ineffective anyway because there'd be so few of you compared to the number of sheer volume of incoming aircraft. And you'd miss the next raid anyway in the time it took you to return to the carrier, rearm, refuel, and come back. So it wouldn't have helped.
Yeah,
an escort carrier in the middle of the convoy might have helped a little, but as Drac mentioned, the escort carriers that were available at the time, in fact, the next convoy, PQ18, had the escort carrier Avenger, which only had 8 aircraft on board anyway, and those aircraft were far more valuable in hunting down submarines than they were for defending the convoy from air attack. So it just wasn't practical.
Yeah, and in terms of if the Germans had just gone, you know what, we're all in, we're sending everything, it would have been an interesting fight, but it still would have been the Allies' fight to lose, because they would have had 2 full proper battleships. If they joined the cruiser covering force up with the heavy covering force, they actually now match heavy cruisers for heavy cruisers, and the Allies have light cruisers on top of that, and they will have more destroyers, and they will have the aircraft from Victorious. And although, as we just said, the fighter's not particularly useful against the Luftwaffe attacks, torpedo strikes against the heavier German ships, A, useful if they hit, B, even if they don't hit, very useful at breaking up their formations. And at this point, the Allies do have an advantage with more advanced radars and such like. So, if the Germans had rolled all the dice and sent absolutely every ship they had in Norway after it, it would have been a very close and very messy fight, and there definitely would have been heavy losses on both sides. But the Allies do have the preponderance of firepower and technology at that point, and it would have been the single largest surface action of World War II.
Yeah, but it wouldn't have stopped PQ18.
And in actual fact, at that point, you would have had a lot fewer merchant ships, a lot losses, a lot of warships would have died, and it would have been one of those things that everyone talks about for the next 80 years. But weirdly enough, most of the merchant ships probably would have been fine.
Yeah, and there wouldn't have been a Tirpitz, Hipper, Scheer, and Lutzow around to threaten PQ18, which would have had to worry about air attacks and submarines and nothing else, and had a heavier covering force.
And then you have to worry about where else gets visited by 617 and all those wonderful tool boys if Tirpitz isn't around.
Yeah.
I think they would have found some suitable target.
Yeah, there's always something to blow up.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
And in World War II.
Good question. Next question from Iraq here. as PQ17 had 13 out of 36 surviving. That's incorrect. It's actually 11 out of 35. But in September, PQ18 with stronger escorts had 27 out of 40 make it to Archangel. What was the risk level allies were willing to take, adding that the Russians gave no help in protecting convoys?
This is a question that Winston Churchill answered before PQ16. When he remarked that basically if the convoy gets through with 50% losses, it's a good thing. Because that's another factor. Basically, the British were aware that the summer is coming, so basically the endless daylight. So they knew that the convoys will be very risky, and they wanted to stop them. Sorry.
Yeah, you've got just covering for Tucky while he's clearing his throat. Is that you do have to factor in that after these disasters, there was a suspension of summertime convoys. Yeah, they had happened before. They weren't going to happen again for a long while after this. So it did, although for all the reasons we've been discussing for the past couple of hours, there are a lot of factors that go into this particular incident. The end result of it was that the Allies did actually say, well, this block of time is actually too risky for us unless and until we can either reduce the German threat or increase our own coverage, or ideally both.
Okay.
There was actually even, because after PQ17 there were no convoys for a prolonged time, basically until between September and December. So in end of October there was Operation FB, which was kind of a desperation operation, where 13 merchant ships were sent from Iceland to USSR under cover of darkness, basically alone. They were sent in half-day intervals. And out of the 13 ships, 3 returned because of the weather damage, and 5 were sunk. So only 5 made it through.
Oh, that's pretty bad odds.
Yeah.
There was one. Yes.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, after PQ17, do you want to hear the telegram that Churchill sent to Stalin?
Yes.
In Churchill voice, please.
No.
Yeah, come on, chat loved it. I loved it. No.
All right. Here we go. My naval advisors tell me that if they had the handling of the German surface, submarine, and air forces in present circumstances, they would guarantee the complete destruction of any convoy to North Russia. They have not been able so far to hold out any hopes that convoys attempting to make the passage in perpetual daylight would fare better than PQ17. It is therefore with the greatest regret that we have reached the conclusion that to attempt to run the next convoy, PQ18, would bring no benefit to you and would only involve dead loss to a common cause. Stalin's reply basically said, balls to that, send the next convoy, regardless of the losses. PQ17 was sent with a vastly stronger covering force and suffered almost as bad losses. At which point Churchill said, bollocks to you, Joseph. No more daylight convoys.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Jingles. See, it was worth it. Next question from Higgins JF H1072. Great nickname, dude. How do you feel about the role that the corvettes played in PQ17, and do you think they could be good for anti-submarine warfare in World of Warships?
Well,
dinner served. I think that solves your hunger problem.
Monsieur?
So I guess this is probably the...
No, we're going to watch Jingles eat now.
Enjoy.
Merci beaucoup.
Jingles is being fed.
Ooh.
Pasta, meatballs, chorizo, and lots of cheese.
Sounds lovely.
I'm getting hungry now.
So yeah, the corvettes of the PQ17 had made a useful job before the convoy dispersed. After it dispersed, it came to basically nobody really knew what exactly does the scatter involve. So there were captains who preferred to really go it alone. There were captains who tried to form mini convoys, and there were escort ships. Basically, there were 2 anti-aircraft escort ships as the biggest units, whose commanders thought that it's their duty to save as many of the light escorts as possible, because they knew that, like, if they were to face off torpedoes, they are completely useless with their 4-inch pop guns. So they basically formed most of the corvettes and lighter escorts into 2 groups and headed for the safety of Novaya Zemlya. One of the corvettes of this mini convoy, the HMS Lotus, her commander changed his mind after receiving distress call. After distress call, so they turned back and saved quite a lot of merchant sailors in the end. But most of the corvettes basically beelined it to the Novaya Zemlya and then got without much incident to Arkhangelsk. Just to then go out again and escort back the surviving ships, basically in 2 mini convoys between the Novaya Zemlya and the Russian ports.
The thing you have to remember about corvettes is that their value isn't really in their effectiveness. I mean, they're armed with a single 3 or 4 inch gun and lots of depth charges. And to a degree, they are very, very good escorts against submarines. They're excellent bang for the buck. But it's the buck rather than the bang, which is what makes corvettes so good, because they are so incredibly cheap and you can build them so incredibly quickly, and they are pretty effective for the amount of money that they cost.
But they're not particularly brilliant anti-aircraft vessels, which was the biggest problem, as it turned out. And no number of corvettes is ever going to be able to take on the Tirpitz unless the Tirpitz happens to miss one and run it over, shortly followed by the entire depth charge rack detonating. Which I suppose with Punjabi is technically possible, but I don't know. You probably need like a D1000 to roll for that one.
To answer the final part of that question, how effective do you think they'd be in World of Warships? Well, if you want to play World of Warships and a ship with 5,000 health that's armed with a single 3 inch gun and a bunch of depth charges, you're a braver man than I am.
Yes.
Yeah, try taking a crippled tier 2 destroyer out into a tier 8 game and see how long you last. That'll be about the same experience.
Yeah, but basically what you mentioned with the depth charges against Tirpitz, that's actually one of the A-team style shenanigans that the crew of the trawler Ayrshire did, because I mean it was partially probably make work just to make the crew think about something else than having Tirpitz potentially coming right at them. But the commander of the trawler had the crew tie depth charges to empty fuel barrels to basically create improvised mines that he intended to throw off his stern in case the Tirpitz came calling. So it was a very, very, very desperate measure.
Cool. Let's head over to the next question. Shrag58 says, the reality is that the book most people have read about this event is David Irving's work. Considering Irving's poor reputation as a historian, is there a good modern account? I think who has the answer to this?
I have to confess I haven't read David Irving's book, so I couldn't answer the first part of that question. The second part of the question, however, I can answer, because the book that I read in preparation for this very stream is called The Road to Russia, Arctic Convoys 42 to 45 by Bernard Edwards. And it's excellent. All kinds of eyewitness accounts from the survivors, transcripts from the reports. Particularly, there was a report. Ooh, that autofocus is practically drunk.
You know you can switch that off, right?
I can't. I've tried. Trust me. My webcam is no longer officially supported in Windows. So there's no control panel settings for it.
Okay. This is somebody in Jingles YouTube viewers. Send them a new webcam, please.
But anyway, that book that I just mentioned that I've already forgotten, very, very good. Doesn't just talk about the convoys, talks about what happened at the other end when they got to Murmansk, which is a bit of an eye-opener as well. But something that I suspect we're probably running out of time and won't have the opportunity to discuss in much detail.
No. Let's look at one more question.
I'll quickly drop my recommendation, because that was also an excellent book. The Ghost Ships of Archangel by William Garou, probably with English pronunciation, which covers basically, it focuses on the mini convoy of Ayrshire and the 3 merchant ships, but it covers the background of the convoy, especially of the PQ17, but the general background of the Arctic convoys, and it provides a very, very vivid descriptions of actually like weather and all the issues connected with it. So I can recommend that one.
Cool. Let's do one more question, right?
Yeah.
Then we'll call it. I think Jingles really wants to finish his pasta. So, question is from Hell's Caretaker. How effective were U-boats operating long distances, such as near the United States?
Incredibly effective, and you can thank Admiral King for that one.
Yes.
At least at first.
I mean, it depends greatly on exactly which kind of U-boat you're talking about. Because if you're going to take an early model Type 7, you're basically like, oh, the American coast, that's nice. Better head home. It's a little bit glib, but it's near enough. Whereas if you're taking a Type 9, much bigger, longer range, more capable for that kind of operation, then yeah, you're going to be, as Jingle said, as Admiral, thanks to Admiral King, you're going to be very, very effective. So yeah, it depends on the not only the mark of U-boat, but also where along the production line it is, because obviously later Type 7s are different capability, later Type 9s different capability. You've also got the resupply U-boats the Germans would eventually set up in the mid-Atlantic for a while, so that would extend.
Milk cows.
Yeah.
What's the Conway? I'm sure can give us the proper German name for them.
Milchkühe.
That's the one.
So yeah, so all of these factors, it's going to depend time, submarine type, what support has it got, and what exactly are the Americans doing. Best case scenario, you're off the coast with a Type 9, nice undisturbed travel over, and all the coastal cities are lit up. At which point, happy days.
City lights blazing because nobody's enforcing a blackout. Ships just sailing around wherever because Admiral King's refusing to form them into convoys because that's British thinking, damn it. And so on.
At which point it's like, well, how many torpedoes and how many rounds for your deck gun do you have? That gives you an approximate idea of how many targets you can take out. The flip side to that is a year or two down the line, you so much as pop a periscope anywhere near New York Harbor and suddenly you discover the sky's turned into aluminium. And there's a lot of very, very angry people with a nice white star on a blue roundel who are very keen to make your acquaintance.
Yeah, there's a reason why they called it the second happy time when they started attacking shipping along the eastern seaboard of the USA.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know we didn't answer all of your questions, but I think we did a good run of it. I really hope you enjoyed this. We do this, we do this for you. Because we think that naval history is interesting and, we think it's worth remembering, not just in World of Warships. So please do me one favor if you haven't yet. Find Drachinifel and find the Mighty Jingles. Subscribe to them on YouTube. Donate all of your money, some of your money to them. I'm sure they have merchandise you can buy, whatever.
All of their money.
all of your money.
You were right the first time.
Yes, but most of all, show them your love if you do love them, and I'm sure you do. From my side, thank you very much. The next Armchair Admirals stream will be taking place, barring any unforeseen boat barbecue extravaganzas, on the 28th of August. 2020, so in 1 month and 1 week.
Trust us, they said. We're Germans. We can organize this.
Look.
Yes, yeah, guys. Sorry, there was.
Yes, but then there was my boss who decided, hey, this is a perfect day to throw a barbecue.
Yes, but he's German as well.
No, he's not German.
His
boss.
Oh, right, okay.
Yes, he's Finnish, technically. So we will be thinking of you on the boat next week. And from my side, I guess that's almost it. We do have a little bit of a sellout. You have a few more minutes to redeem the bonus code. It is a Drahtesel, German for wire donkey, also known as a bicycle. It gives you a mission in-game that will give you a German destroyer container if you are good enough to complete it. It's a bit spicy. Good luck. Then the other thing I wanted to mention is we do have a Teespring store now. We didn't launch this Teespring store because we want to get filthy rich of selling t-shirts. We don't. We've made the prices very, very, very cheap, and we've cut our profit margins for some of them basically to zero because we're doing this because you guys said you want t-shirts, and well, if you want t-shirts, who are we to say no? Yep. So have t-shirts. If you want to find our Teespring store, you can either scroll down on YouTube or scroll down on Twitch, and it'll be right there. You can find a link to it. We have some nice designs, including some face masks if you want to be responsible and snazzy at the same time. Any more selling out that we have to do? I think
not.
I think we're done.
I
with selling
think
out,
see
yes?
you next week on Thursday stream.
Well, I think it's time for closing remarks. Jingles.
Text 5. No, I got it wrong. I am so shit at selling out. Am I allowed to say shit, by the way? Oh, too late. I've done it twice now. Text Jingles to 500 500 to get your free Audible trial and claim James Hornfisher's Audible audiobook version of Neptune's Inferno absolutely free.
That's actually a really good idea, by the way. If you like, guys, honestly, if you've never done an Audible trial and you like naval history, this is probably a good recommendation because it's a good book.
Yeah.
It'll teach you a lot.
It's a great book.
But Jingles, I have to say one thing, right?
Yes.
I think a lot more people would be willing to do this if there was a version narrated by you.
Hey, look, I've spoken to my good friend Jim, and he knows people in the publishing houses in the East Coast, and he has said that he'll put in a word for me and get me an audiobook gig.
I think that was a fantastic idea because I will listen to it, and I think
Yes.
most of chat would also do it. Yes. Okay, Drachinifel.
All I will say is, for those of you who understand the reference, please make all the possible benedictions to the Omnissiah you can. Sacred unguents, sacred incense, random cogs, offerings of toasters, whatever, because currently I'm doing this from my laptop because my main PC is expletive deleted at the moment. So within the next 24 hours, I hope to either have it fixed or have it into sufficiently disassembled into enough parts with enough violence that it makes me feel at least slightly therapeutic, which is putting some of the videos I wanted to release over this weekend and next at risk. So please,
you have displeased the great machine spirit.
Yeah,
I will
cross my fingers. Also, chat, cross your fingers that my Indomitus box does indeed arrive tomorrow. Closing remarks for Mr. Tuccy.
Well, it's been fun. I'm looking forward to the next month's installment. We will have to brainstorm which will be the topic.
Yes. Any initial thoughts about next month's topic, guys?
What's our shortlist say?
I actually forgot our shortlist, so.
July.
But guys in the chat, if you have some suggestions, come to the forums, to the article about the stream, and provide suggestions there. Remember, it should be something that ideally happened during August.
During August of World War II, at some point.
Or World War I.
Lots of stuff happened
yeah.
there. Oh, we could go back. Yes, that could be interesting. Cool. Excellent. Okay, so thank you very much for that. And on that vein, we are going to be launching our traditional post-stream raid because we have so much British power unified here. We are going to be raiding someone else who's British. Please, what Jingles? Copy pasta for chat. You know how this goes, right?
Somebody explain. Oh, it's good night from me, and it's good night. I don't know what you're talking about. Sorry.
No. We're gonna give chat something, and they're just gonna spam their chat with it.
Oh right. Oh, I get it. Okay. Since we're on the topic anyway, I think it has to be blood for the blood god.
Okay.
Okay. Let me just type that up for you guys.
Or
blood god.
If you're a 40k hipster, it could of course also be skulls.
No hipsters allowed here.
Too late.
Okay.
Too late.
With that being said, thank you very much all for tuning in. We will see you again soon, probably next Thursday for our regular scheduled live stream. And until then, have a fantastic weekend. Enjoy World of Warships, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.